Hello and welcome back to Project Next. My name is Finn Blake and I'm using coffee dates to investigate the minds of CEOs, entrepreneurs and world leaders. I am extremely excited to be bringing you unparalleled insight into some of the brightest minds out there. Well, if you're anything like the other consumers that contributed to the $140 million Australian gin market in 2020, then you'll love today's guest. And if you didn't contribute to this booming market, you'll still love today's guest. On today's episode, I'm speaking to Cam Mackenzie, the co-founder of 4 Pillars Gin, ex-Olympian and all-round good bloke. In this episode, Cam will give some incredible insight into how he went from running at the 400-metre relay at the 96 Olympics to running one of the most recognisable gin brands on the globe. If you like or hate this episode, let us know on our socials and don't forget to subscribe and tell everyone that you know. Cam Mackenzie, the co-founder of 4 Pillars Gin Distillery. I'm very excited to have this interview today on Project Next. First reason is because obviously the premise of this podcast is that we meet up for coffee dates, but I couldn't come to the 4 Pillars Gin Distillery and not have a cocktail. So thank you so much for sorting out the cocktails for us, Cam, and I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about how you went from being an Olympic athlete, a runner, to founding one of the most famous and recognisable gin companies in the world. So thank you so much for joining me.
Mate, Finn, thank you for having me on, and I can assure you this is our version of coffee. The martini is the greatest coffee in the world.
I can see why.
No, terrific to be here. Thanks for asking me along.
So I do actually want to go right back to the start of your journey and find out a little bit more about what made you tick even as a kid. So you started out obviously as a runner. So what made you gravitate towards running as a young kid?
I think it helped I had 4 older brothers, so I was running from them a lot of the time. Look, I don't really know. I think every kid at school has something they're probably known for. Some are good footy players, some are good at maths or English or, whatever. I just happened to be the fastest in the schoolyard, and it was not something I ever intended to pursue. It's just something I did. Right through year 12, I didn't train. I would just turn up on a Saturday after a hamburger and run the 100, and I would go okay. And I wasn't winning all the races. I was the fastest at my school. I didn't win the APS sports. I think I finished 5th or 6th even. I'm not too sure. But I think in hindsight, probably all of the things I've done over the years, you end up there by default a little bit, or you slightly by mistake, or you make a decision. It's that sliding doors moment. Yeah. So I was very, very lucky, when I finished school and started at uni in hotel management.
But before you actually did finish and you were, at the peak of your powers in running and in APS sport and things, were you a pretty big dreamer? Like, did you always find that as though it was feasible to go and, journey off to the Olympic Games, or was that just a big coincidence? Or
completely the opposite. I was a dreamer in that I did not pay any attention in classes. I would look out the window,
dreamer,
just thinking I would much rather be fishing. It was never running because I never trained. I don't even think we had an athletics coach back then. I just used to turn up and run. Yeah. So. No, quite the opposite. I know all of my mates who I trained with and a few of the guys who went to the Olympics with me and were far greater athletes than me, they probably had that pressure on as kids. Yeah. I never got that pressure from my parents. I think they were just very happy to see me out having a crack at something.
What age did you go, okay, I'm good enough to actually make something of this. Maybe I should instill a little bit more competitiveness in myself. What age did that sort of tick in your mind?
Early 20s, I started to sort of go, I can actually stand next to certainly most of the national level guys and not disgrace myself if I really go that next step and start training maybe 4 or 5 times a week. I reckon I'm half a chance of actually making a national final one day, and that sort of progressed. But I was running the 100 and the 200. This was the other weird thing. It wasn't until I was 25 that I was going to give it away. I'd finished uni. I had attempted to go as far as I can avoiding a real job. It's still a motto of mine today. And my coach said, why don't you just have one season of 400-metre running? And I'd never run them. I hated them. They're a painful event. And a year later, I went to the Olympics.
Ladbroke, along with Michael Joubert behind him, then Paul Green and Cameron McKenzie. The Australians this morning.
It's a horrible race, and that is the key. It's a mental race, and it is a sprinter's marathon. You know, if you can run a great 200-metre time, chances are you can probably run a pretty good 400-metre time. And that was my theory, was I'm nowhere near as fit as these guys. The last 50, no, being generous, last 100 metres is going to be pretty ugly. But I reckon if I can set it up with enough of a break, they won't chase me down, you know, and that was my theory. And it just put me in a position, you know, at the right place at the right time for Olympic selection, because it was 96 Atlanta. It was the Olympics before Sydney, so they wanted a good, healthy team in Atlanta to build towards Sydney. And I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. I think there's so many athletes far better than me that never made an Olympic team because they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or they got injured at the wrong time. And there's so much luck involved. But I think also the fact that I just didn't have all of that childhood pressure dragging around on my shoulders. I knew it was never going to buy me a house. There was no money in it. In fact, you know, Jason Richardson and I talk about this a bit, and Jason's now doing the races on Channel 7, and he won a stall gift, and he's a ripper bloke. And Richo and I used to sit there training together saying, can we justify doing this any longer? You know, at some point, there's stuff we want to do outside this sport. For me, it was wine. For him, it was, you know, sports admin and all sorts of things. Can we keep justifying this? And had it not been for the Sydney Olympics, we probably wouldn't have. We probably would have pulled the pin. You know?
I was actually going to ask you as well. So you're training 4 or 5 times a week, and you're putting a lot of time and effort into this sport. What was sort of taking up your time when you weren't running and doing training and things?
Sleep, a lot of sleep. Yeah. I was working at a pub. Most of the time I found myself at the Vaucluse Hotel in Richmond. I worked there for years part-time and loved it, you know, and in a way, that's how I fell into wine. You know, like I said at the start, you get everywhere by default. And much as I'd studied hotel management and I loved the wine and booze components of it, but all I ever wanted to do was run a pub. That was my focus in life.
So that was the plan B?
That was the plan.
Okay.
It wasn't even plan B. The plan was to run a pub, which I've always said was probably a reasonable reflection of my attitude towards study, was the fact that I just wanted to run a pub. So, you know, I thought that could be good. So I went and worked at the Vaucluse for Peter Beretta. But back then you could smoke in pubs too. And I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. And I was getting home trying to go and train the next day, having passively smoked a pack or 2 of cigarettes. And I just couldn't do it. I was getting all sorts of, you know, head colds and, you know, infections. And it became obvious that's what the problem was. So I started working more in the retail side of his business, chatting to winemakers that would come through, buying wine, tasting wine, and I just completely fell in love with wine, which was, in a way, the beginning of the end of a career in athletics, but kind of a nice door to open and a road that you knew was there and wasn't going anywhere. So I could kind of justify the next couple of years of training.
And so when you were training, and you speak of how painful the 400-metre race was and how much you hated it, how was the temptation to just give it all up and go and invest your time in being in the hospitality industry? Was it something that you often thought about, or was it just, okay, I want to give this a good crack and see what happens?
No, I wanted to give it a good crack. And you know, probably from 24, 25 onwards, it was almost my profession. There was no money in it. I wasn't earning any money at all. And, you know, I was scrounging money, saving money to go to Grand Prix races around Australia and trying to justify it, really. But, you know, I was very fortunate then to start, you know, training with some interesting people. After Atlanta, I travelled for 3 or 4 months around Europe with Kathy Freeman as one of her training partners. And it was just an extraordinary experience. You're suddenly meeting, you know, Donovan Bailey, the world record holder in the 100 metres, and Linford Christie's walking past at training. And, you know, you suddenly get a bit addicted to it. So I know I'm sleeping on a couch somewhere in Shoreditch, but I'm in London and I'm training with some of the best athletes in the world. People would kill to be in this position. So I'm just going to keep it going for as long as I can. And Sydney Olympics is there. I'm probably at the northern end age limit as a sprinter to make it. I would have been 30 for Sydney, but why wouldn't I do it? If it wasn't in Sydney, I probably would have happily pulled the pin after 97, 98. They were my best 2 seasons. And I would have happily just gone on to do the next thing. But, I sort of loved it. But that was also the time that I probably made that hard decision to say, okay, I need to start to build that foundation of what this looks like next, because I was also training with and seeing a lot of guys who'd done nothing. They'd dropped out of school, hadn't finished year 12, certainly didn't have a degree behind them, and had no idea what they wanted to do. And I was like, I really don't want to be those people. I want to go on, and I've had a sense of achievement now in something I never thought I would do. What's the next sense of achievement and satisfaction for me?
Well, that's something that I really, really want to hone in on, because there are so many people that even I know firsthand that have gone into, footy or running or whatever sport they specialise in, and they've put all their eggs in one basket and, really worry about the issues that they might encounter when they go forward, and potentially don't have a plan B because they haven't been able to allocate those resources. So what would the advice be in terms of maintaining that balance and making sure that you kind of hedge your bets in terms of where you head in your career?
Yeah, look, there's no easier time to study than when you're training, to be honest. You have a lot of downtime, and a lot of it is recovery time where, you don't necessarily need to be sleeping, but you don't want to be active. So study is a great option. It takes your mind off the stresses of training. But I also think, people have got to look at the horizon, perhaps not as plan B, but as the next plan A, because you're a long time retired from sport, so you can apply yourself brutally in that space. It's actually healthy to be thinking about what's on the horizon, but you're not going to be able to do it forever. You might, some people are fortunate enough to set themselves up financially forever, but I think most athletes in most pursuits are mentally pretty hungry. They like the challenge, and the ones that go pear-shaped are the ones that finish and are not challenged. So to actually have a challenge, and for me that was going to be the wine industry, that was a brilliant little next carrot for me to aim for, and it justified the last couple of years of my athletics. I could kind of justify it quite easily.
What did it look like for you when you were at the Olympics? You're about to run a 400-metre relay race with some of your best mates. What were they all doing? Because you obviously had the wine industry and hospitality and everything. What were they sort of channeling their external energy into?
That is actually very funny you ask me that, because I remember when we left Brisbane to fly to the US for, maybe 5 or 6 weeks before the Olympics to sort of do acclimatise to better weather and train in North Carolina. There were 2 busloads heading from our hotel to Brisbane Airport before we flew out. And the second bus, a whole heap of us loaded onto the second bus so that we could stop at Department of Social Security and put our last dole form in because we were all on the rock and roll because we'd all quit our jobs. And this was, some of these guys are now lawyers. Some of them have gone on to do great things in business. But at the time, they were all on the rock and roll, getting paid a few dollars a week. And we very nearly signed a poster for the Brisbane DSS department as a sponsor to say thanks for your help. And they couldn't understand what was going on. We all walked in our national tracksuit that we travelled in and handed in our last form and walked out and got on the bus and flew to America. So that was kind of what was happening. Paul Green, who was in our relay teams, now a great musician and doing a lot of indie stuff and a lot of recording stuff with other musicians up north. Mark Ladbrokes a really fantastic coach. He just coached the national 400, 200 champion who should go to the Olympics, and he's coaching a lot in rugby and a number of other sports. And I'm not sure what Mick Joubert's doing. I think he's taken a more holistic approach and does sort of massage and that sort of stuff up in the hinterland somewhere. So, but at the time, Mark was probably the only one that I would have said, yeah, he'll stay in the sport.
Yep.
Everyone else will probably do something else.
And so for your own journey, you finish up, you've done the 1996 Olympics, and you are transitioning into the hospitality industry. So tell me about the studies that you did and how you found the transition into getting out of athletics to business.
Yeah, probably one of the best things that happened to me in 1998 was I got a stress fracture in my back.
Oh.
And in hindsight, again, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me because I couldn't train for a while. And it was kind of early March. And I thought, well, I really should try and get my hands dirty in this industry now. I've been working in pubs for ages, so I've been getting my hands dirty there and loving it. But if I really want to learn wine, I need to learn from the ground up. So I literally drove out here to the Yarra and just drove from winery to winery, hoping to chat to someone who, might just, I don't know, give me some work experience somewhere in a winery. And I was very, very fortunate to meet Rob Dolan out at Yarra Ridge Winery. And Rob, unbeknownst to me, was a former ruckman for Port Adelaide back in the early 80s. He won a couple of premierships with Port. His nickname was Sticks. He's a big, rangy bloke. Well, he's not these days. Sorry, Robbo, he's gained a pound or two. But just one of the world's best blokes. And we sat down and he grabbed a handful of biscuits and made 2 terrible coffees, and we sat there and talked for about 3 hours, just about nothing, really. Sport, everything, family, sport, careers. And at the end of it, he said, so do you want a job? And I said, mate, I'd love a job, but I've got absolutely no experience in this whatsoever. And he said, terrific. You've learnt no bad habits. We can just teach you from the ground up. So I joined the vintage crew that year for all the fruit coming through and ended up staying in the cellar there for a couple of years and just loved it. Absolutely loved it.
And do you think that's a sliding doors moment in terms of knocking on Rob's door and going, can I please, you didn't ask for the job, but it kind of came out of networking. Is that something that you think is really important for people coming through that industry and all industries generally?
Yeah, absolutely. You've got to be a bit brave there, I think, and you've got to knock on a few doors and ask people if they've got contacts in certain areas. People are incredibly generous and incredibly kind, and I think particularly in sport, if you are nudging sort of that level, you become a bit of a novelty for people in a way, and Robbo is still one of my greatest mates. In fact, we started our distillery at the back of his winery 7 years ago. So we've stayed connected, and even after that connection, the number of contacts he's put me in touch with, because he is the world's best bloke and he's such a good winemaker and everyone just loves him. He'll just pick up a phone and make a phone call, and next thing you know, you're chatting to all of these different people. It's so important, if you can find your niche, and it doesn't matter what it is. It's really surprising. Someone will know someone who can help you along the way, and you shouldn't be bashful about it. You've just got to be humble and say, I am new to this and this is who I am. I'm not bullshitting anyone. I don't know the first thing about crushing grapes or any of the equipment here, but geez, I'd love to learn.
What made you want to learn as well? Because you obviously had no previous experience, and what was the appeal of doing winemaking and particularly working with Rob and coming through that business?
Oh, look, I think, I came out of a family of food. My mum loved to cook, and I just loved wine and I loved beer. I think working in pubs, I've always had an affinity with booze. But I've always loved it, and I've always loved tasting it and aroma and flavour. And so for me, that was the fascination. I always liked the look of vineyards and wineries. It's got quite a romantic image to it, but it's bloody hard work. And you find that out within day one, how hard that industry is. But I'd also been lacking a few weeks of real physical work at training because I was injured. And this wasn't something that was going to hurt my back. It was such a stupid injury. It really only hurt when I sprinted. So I could actually be physical again. And I was outside, dragging hoses around and rolling barrels around and climbing over things. Geez, WorkSafe would have had a field day. But, it was old school stuff. And even within the vintage crew back then, I look at it now of the guys that were just cellar hands like me, and they've all gone on to become quite renowned winemakers in their own right, making world famous brands, and we just clicked as a crew.
You end up in 2010 starting to play a little bit with gin. Where did that curiosity come from? The gin.
Yeah, Stu Gregor, who's one of my partners here, and Stu and I have been best mates for 20 odd years. He is probably the one who destroyed the athletic career completely, in that I went to work for him just before the Sydney Olympics. Foster's owned the winery at the time, and they heard that I was out there, and they said, well, if you're going to make the Sydney Olympics, you can't possibly do all this physical work while you're training. So we're going to give you a cushy marketing job and you're going to go and work with this guy, Stuart Gregor. And I think if you put on a map or on a graph the point at which I meet Stu, that's the day my athletic career plummeted and my booze career took off. And we just became really great mates and hung out and were quite stupid. But initially we talked about making tonic water. Because we thought, we could see overseas there was a bit happening in craft distilling and in gin. And we thought, that's really interesting. We'll never get a license for gin because it's all controlled by the tax office. And it's very hard to get a license. Back then it was anyway. So we thought, we'll never get a license to idiots like us. So tonic water seemed like a good idea. But I couldn't build a soft drink factory. So
why not?
Well, I didn't have the wherewithal to do it. I didn't have the funding to do it.
Yeah.
And I just didn't know how to do it. It wasn't booze, it didn't have anything about it that was overly interesting. It was just what we thought was a good business idea. But also it meant I'd have to make it under contract, so it was a great idea, but I'd be back behind a desk. And the whole idea was I wanted to get my hands dirty. So I just went through the Breaking Bad phase,
The Breaking Bad phase?
My famous Breaking Bad phase was I bought a little glass lab still, a little 3-litre glass still.
Yeah.
And just started playing with distillation of vodka with botanicals, which is essentially all gin is. Yeah. And I bought.
Why was it that rather than a whiskey or other sort of spirits that aren't white?
I just didn't drink a lot of whiskey.
Okay.
I tasted stuff, but I didn't drink it. If I had a drink, I'd have a gin and tonic or a martini. Yeah. And I also kind of probably at the time it wasn't something I was thinking much about, but. Gin had always been there. My grandmother drank gin, my mother drank gin. I stole gin as a 16-year-old. It was the easiest bottle to fill up with water and hope mum wouldn't notice. So I'd always kind of had this gin thing going on. And that was why. It was as simple as that, and just playing with botanicals. And I always thought some of the native botanicals could be kind of interesting. I had to go on a police registry to buy that still, because it's the same equipment you would essentially buy, apparently, to make crystal meth.
There you go.
Yeah.
It really could have been a Breaking Bad phase.
Absolutely. That's why we called it the Breaking Bad phase. I had the local copper on my door one day. And I opened the door and he's standing there and he said, "Cam." And I'm like, "Stu, we got our kids are at school."
Yeah.
He's looking at this list of lab equipment. He's like, "Mate, I know you've got 3 daughters, but we've got to find a better way to pay for it than crystal meth." And I'm like, "No, it's all good. Come in, I'll show you what I'm doing." So, that was sort of how it started, was just those tiny little distillates playing with juniper and then branching out into other things for a couple of years before we got our act together.
And so I've actually got a little bit of a stat here, because the Australian gin market has grown to $140 million per year. So you clearly discovered the art of distilling at the right time back in 2010. There was no real big driver, correct me if I'm wrong, of gin and especially craft gin in Australia. So what was that, any sort of coincidence, or did you plan that?
Oh, it might be more arse than class. I don't know. One of the great things about wine was we were travelling a lot. So we were going over to the US and the UK, and we could see other things starting to get some momentum, and one of them was gin. And we had kind of decided to go down that road, and we were comfortable to set up something quite small but scalable. And probably halfway down that road, we came across a brand in the UK called Sipsmith, which is a gin I totally admire, and great guys, great gin. But they started in a garage in the UK, and they had really made some waves in London, in particular in bars in London, and that gave us a bit of confidence that that's a trend that we could see happening here with an Australian distillery. And that's when I was quite terrified. Stu, by this stage, had set up a very good sort of PR communications business in Sydney called Liquid Ideas that specialised in food, booze, hospitality, tourism, these sorts of things. And I was quitting a job with a mortgage and 3 kids and a slightly nervous wife to set up a gin distillery in Australia, which in a wine region in Australia, which just seemed back then probably a bit silly, but we kind of felt it was the right thing to do.
Why?
Well, just no one had done it. Like, Not to the extent we were planning. So we were just rightly nervous about it, and you should be nervous. It's pre-race jitters. You should be nervous. If you're not nervous, well, what's the point? Like I think you got to get your adrenaline going. So I sort of insisted that this can't be a folly. This had to be a proper business. It's got to have fun to it. It's got to be interesting and different. But I need some security around the fact that I can do this for a couple of years before it falls over. So we got Matt Jones in, who Matt had come back from New York. He was creative director of a big global creative company called Jack Morton. He's a bit younger than Stu and I. And he and Stu had some common clients. Matt had come back. He's Welsh, but he'd set up a business here after marrying an Australian girl. And he, I think his clients were like Facebook and Google. So nice guy to have.
Not bad,
to be honest. Yeah, and we spent a weekend with him talking about it all and what we wanted to do. And he wrote this beautifully concise document about gin and the opportunity within gin, having just chatted to us, and said, "I don't suppose you want a third partner." And that's kind of how the three of us came together. And he just identified a whole lot of really interesting things that had been informally floating around in my mind. But he's such a deep thinking guy, and he is so strategic that it was lovely to have a guy come in and just pull that together into some really interesting key points.
Well, it's interesting that you still remember that document. Is it something that you found was really hard hitting at that time, and do you still think about it now?
I still think about it most weeks. It was a pivotal moment in our business, because if we hadn't done that, chances are we might have made a couple of barrels of whiskey, and we might have made an absinthe, and we might have done some really interesting but dumb and unfocused things. Whereas Matt said to us, your opportunity is gin. It's a category that hasn't innovated. It has stayed exactly the same as what your grandmother drank, right through to probably the late 90s, until Bombay Sapphire started to put some energy behind it, then Tanqueray 10, and then obviously Hendrix. And I wouldn't be here without those three brands, because they changed gin. They took gin back and showed the world it can be different. It doesn't have to be London Dry gin. At its best, London Dry is pine forest pine needle. At its worst, it's pine oak lean. And there are great London Dries and there's terrible London Dries. Those guys started to innovate, and they started to say, no, we're not London Dries. We're a different style. We still use juniper, the hallmark of gin, and we've got that lovely piney canvas, but we're going to use other interesting things. And they also marketed it, because prior to that, it was all vodka. Vodka took over the world for 30 or 40 years. Funny branding, interesting coloured bottles, blah, blah, blah. Mate, it's a product that smells like nothing, looks like nothing, and tastes like nothing. It's all marketing.
Yep.
So to see some of the bigger brands put some marketing energy and innovation into gin, but it was by no means maxed out. And Matt pointed out to us, we're part of Asia. Australia is part of Asia. What an incredible asset that is for us. So don't become Australiana gin. Don't shove Crocodile Dundee in a bottle. Become modern Australia. What is modern Australia? Talk to chefs, talk to winemakers. I think he even spoke to a couple of artists about what is modern Australia. Don't ignore the spices out of Southeast Asia, but anchor the gins to a couple of key native botanicals here. And those were the things that we took out of that document, but to be quite ruthless in our approach, to not get distracted into other things and just stay in your lane and be gin.
Was there anything that Matt put in that document that you went, okay, that's actually a really good way of thinking about something that I hadn't considered?
Yes, I think so. I think particularly some of the branding around it, I hadn't given that a huge amount of thought. And one of the things he pointed out was a lot of the branding in vodka and in gin at the time was quite feminine, quite deliberately feminine. And he felt we could have a slightly more masculine brand that didn't upset a more feminine market. So that was probably, again, one of the things that I had never even given that much thought at all. We hadn't even really thought much about a name at this point in time, but he was thinking on so many different levels to Stu and I. He balances the more juvenile tendencies of his two partners very, very well. It must drive him insane. But he sets a language around it, and he pointed out to me that great businesses, great brands and great products don't happen by luck. There's a lot of work in there. Every presentation we do with our team, whether it's internally or whether it's our distribution team or our export partners, starts with the same slide, and that is we're makers, not marketers. And if it hasn't started here in Healesville and it hasn't started with liquid, then it's just not going to get any further. And it's the first slide on every presentation we do, and it has been for 8 years, and it always will be.
I know you wanted to be makers, not marketers, but that would have influenced the way that you did market it. So what were the major things that went into how you marketed the business, and how did you come up with the Four Pillars name and brand?
Yeah, look, the name is something Stu and I had used for years. We talked about Four Pillars, loosely speaking, as a foundation. You can build anything on four pillars. So, if we were making wine, we might look at, what are our four pillars? Is it the region, the vintage, the variety, the winemaker, the history? What is it? Let's just come up with four pillars as a great starting point. There's a funnier story that's best told after several Negronis at about 3 a.m. about the four pillars of humanity and our feeling that there are four different types of people. But when we needed a name, Stu kind of threw four pillars out there. And Matt just said, I really like that. And I think people will understand that, because everyone is trying to build that foundation, if you like.
Yeah.
So the name was a very simple one. We came up with the name quite easily, and Matt really loved it. We didn't have any names there that we were particularly worried about. In fact, I can't even recall another option on the table. I think it was just always Four Pillars. So that was really, really good. And I think Matt just sat down strategically and thought about how we do that. What are our four pillars? And that was our first gin. The botanicals that we're using, the stills that we use from Germany, the water, out of the Upper Yarra here, and just a love of craft. Mm-hmm. And it was a genuine moment for us when I saw the word love, because I thought, well, that's what this is built on. It's the fact that I love getting my hands dirty again, and I want to be able to present something that I've made to someone. And Stu was exactly the same, and all of us went, yeah, that's it. That's it.
Awesome.
That just works for us.
And so I want to talk a little bit about the distillery you've got here, because there are some absolute beasts of engineering in here. Tell me about the stills and how you stumbled across them, and what the process is like to get them over to Australia, because I've heard the story of how they get from Germany, but I want to hear it from you.
Yeah, look, Stu and I found these stills in our sort of research trip.
Research trip?
Yeah, look, the logical place to go to research this was the UK, was London. Only everyone in London was making London Dry Gin, and we knew we didn't want to make London Dry Gin. So we decided, let's go to North America, because their craft distilling scene across the board, across all categories, was huge. It was really booming. Not so much in gin. It's not a big gin market, but we just noticed that it was really going crazy over there. So we convinced our wives that he and I should take a trip and drive from Portland, Oregon to Los Angeles, just visiting distilleries for 2.5 weeks. And
not drinking any of the...
Of course not. No. It was 2.5 weeks of complete and utter stupidity. And it was very funny. We spent some time in Spokane, Washington, with Dry Fly Distillery, who were incredibly generous. And at the time, we didn't have much of a knowledge bank in Australia. There's a few guys in Tassie making whiskey, and we get on really well with them now. But at the time, they wouldn't even answer the phone. They wouldn't tell us anything. They wouldn't share knowledge, probably because they were too busy.
Yeah.
Truthfully, they were tiny little teams trying to make whiskey. And no one in the UK would really email us back with anything or answer the phone. So we went to America with a few meetings booked, and they just opened the doors. What do you want to know? Spend a day with us, spend 3 hours with us, take photos, everything. And we walked away from that with a few things. One was, we never want to be the dickheads that say no. So I've got an open door policy here. It's rare that a week goes by that someone from another distillery or someone setting up a distillery doesn't come through for a coffee to look at our safety, our stills, our drainage, and we talk a lot. And I've always said, if I've got the answer, I'll give it to you. But if I don't have the answer, I'll give you the question. because you might not be asking the right question. You know, we've done it. We need to build that knowledge bank in Australia. But the other thing we found was these stills made in Germany by Christian Karl. And everywhere we went that had a Karl still just seemed to have a purity of spirit that we loved, to a point where we almost would taste a spirit and say, is this a Karl still?
Wow.
There was something unmistakable
Iconic.
about it. Yeah, it was amazing. And we didn't know anything about Karl at all. But we knew we needed to have a Karl still.
And how many have you got now?
Well, we've now got 5 Karl stills, 3 production stills and 2 pilot stills. So Wilma was our first.
Named after?
Named after my late mother. That was the perfect name for a still. My mother was quite beautiful, as are these stills, and she, you know, did a power of work. But mate, she had 5 sons, and she could explode at the drop of a hat, which we thought was perfect for a distillery. And she could put away martinis like no one's business. So Wilma was the name of our first still, and even that resonated with people. It just resonated with me for some reason. I thought it was a bit self-indulgent, but I loved the idea of it, and I was going to be standing next to it most of the time. So the guys were like, "It's brilliant, mate. We love it.
Yeah.
Terrific." Jude is our next still, which is a little bit bigger. That's Stu's mum. And interestingly, our third still is now based up in Sydney at our lab up in Surrey Hills. We've got a bar, Eileen's Bar, and the Sydney lab up there on Crown Street. And it's a 70-litre pilot still called Eileen, which is named after Matt's mum. And then on the other side of the production area is Big Betty, which is a 2,000-litre Karl still. And that's certainly the biggest Karl still in Australia. Wilma was the first Karl still in Australia. Beth is named after Scotty Gould's mum. Scotty runs our hospitality area. He was our first full-time employee, and we just surprised him at the Christmas party and named it after his mum. So, yeah, it's always mums, and they're the best stills in the world. You either use a Karl still or you just make up excuses as to why you don't use a Karl still.
So Cam, feel free not to share, but how much does one of these Karl stills set you back?
Depends on the size. For Beth over there, the 2,000-litre still, by the time you add in a steam boiler and all of the connections and commissioning, you wouldn't get a lot of change out of about 900 Aussie. 900 to $1 million, depends on copper prices at the time, I think. But they're worth it. You know, it's a 2-year waiting list to get a Karl still these days.
And so it seems like it's really easy to make, you know, some failures even in, you know, the distilling process. So what did your failures look like in those early times, and what did you learn from them?
Oh, man, we made so many mistakes. And I think everything from dry goods, you know, I tried to use a natural cork at some point, and a whole lot of gin went brown, so that was a mistake. I think we rushed into export markets too soon. That was a mistake. We sacked a whole heap of export partners because they were just all wrong for us. And, you know, look, we didn't do anything that brought us undone. Yeah. And I think we had the funding behind us from the three of us and a merry band of ginvestors who put money into the business. And they were friends and family that we basically said, this is a racehorse. You know, all we can guarantee is you can have fun. Mm-hmm. But we might be pulling the screens around at any moment. We just don't know. But don't put anything in unless you're willing to lose it.
Yep.
But that allowed us the opportunity to take some risks. So I hate to think how many gins I've done that have gone down the drain. Experimental gins. The famous one people talk about is the asparagus gin.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was pretty much exactly what you would expect. It was pretty bloody horrendous. But the fact that we could do that and we could have a laugh about it,
yeah,
and we didn't come undone. Much as I'm sure she hates me saying it, one of the best things we did was we didn't hire a CFO until we were about 5 years old. Mm-hmm. Because a CFO would have a heart attack at half the things that we did here and half the things that we bought. I bought a terrible bottling line out of America that, you know, that was $100,000 mistake.
Yeah.
And I still lose sleep over doing it. But we learnt so much after that big mistake, not to rush into things. And we bought the best stills in the world. Why didn't we buy the best bottling line in the world?
Yeah.
You can't just have it there. So we invested and invested and invested. And we don't always, to this day, we don't always get it right. But I think for the most part, we've got the guts to at least have a crack.
And I feel as though that is one of the foundations or pillars, if you
Yep.
like, of what this business is sort of founded upon, having fun and a real sense of community. You've maintained your roots in the Yarra Valley and Healesville, and I really do love that, and it seems as though it's something that is really important to you. So what lies ahead? Are you going to, continue your growth overseas, or, and I know that without even saying you're going to keep your roots in the Yarra Valley, but what lies ahead, and why have you chosen to make that decision to have those community values?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. We were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. This is the business we always wanted to run. Those guys Stu and Matt come out of agency land, so they deal with clients, and often clients can be pretty brutal with their agencies at times, I gather. I come out of working for other people, and some were good and some were not so good. But this was a business where we could create community and prioritise people. People is such a major factor of this. We have such a low staff turnover here that I'm assuming everyone is enjoying what they're doing. Maybe we're even drunk enough not to ask questions, but there's a sense of loyalty around this business from our team that I really love. I love coming to work every day. I live across the road, so I'm at work every day. Weekend, I come in for a coffee and say good day to a few people I haven't seen during the week, and I just think if you're going to spend that much time at work, you've got to enjoy it. So we've built a team here that we just enjoy working with, and it's incredibly hospitable. And I'm always astounded watching people sit down and do a gin tasting or have a drink here. They're almost a little bit taken aback that the staff are actually really relaxed and friendly. And it's not a wine tasting where someone knows a bit more than you. There's no intimidation in gin. It's fun.
Yeah.
It's just hilarious for us. So we goof off a bit. We probably hired more serious people in the business, which is great, like our CFO, Caroline, I love you, but you're more serious than me. So they can be the seriousness while we can keep building our relationships. We're doubling the size of the distillery at the moment, so it's a $6.5 million development next door, which will increase our hospitality space dramatically. We'll keep the existing space, but we'll increase it dramatically with a great sort of cocktail bar area, so we can sort of celebrate that craft of cocktails. A more casual deck area for G&Ts. We'll move our packaging and bottling and the stuff I think is not as sexy as the copper stills. That'll go next door, but there's a big atrium window to look through to that activity, which will be great. We'll rebuild a couple of our export markets. Duty free was a big part of this business, and that's non-existent at the moment, but we need to rebuild that because it was a really important part of our business. And then from an export point of view, look, we're going quite well in the UK and the US at the moment. Southeast Asia is quite good. We're investing in people. We've hired some people in those markets to help us build those markets better.
And so I just want to pick on that point, because I think that there are so many people out there who would want to be coming into a business like that, or, being even an entrepreneur and seeing the business from the inside so that they can take things away in terms of a business perspective and embody it into their own, starting up businesses. What would the advice be from you in terms of attributes that you think are really important to come into a business like this or turn into, start up your own business?
It's great to take risks at that point in time. Go overseas when you can. Go overseas and work. There's so many things in there, but don't be afraid to fail. Like, failure is awesome. It's bitter at the time, and it's one of my. If I had a frustration with one of my partners, with Stu, and again, he knows this because we talk about it a lot. When we win something, we celebrate it long and hard. We shout it from the rooftops, and then we get on with our job. If something goes wrong, I will lose sleep for a week. I'm scathing on myself, and I'll stew over it and mull over it. Stu will move on within an hour. And I keep saying you can't have both. If you're going to celebrate the victories as long and as hard as you are, you actually have to rip apart the defeats and find out how to improve. And then and only then, you can move on without ever thinking about it again, other than what you've learnt from it. But if you keep sweeping them all under the carpet, it builds up and it builds up and it builds up, and you're not learning from it. So maybe it's just something, I don't know that I'm ever going to change him. Maybe I don't want to change him either, because I quite enjoy watching the process of it. And I enjoy the celebrations. He's in charge of celebrations. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Cam. I really appreciate the time, and thank you so much for giving us some insight and welcoming us into this beautiful distillery. I really look forward to hearing everyone else's experiences of coming up here, because it's such a beautiful part of the world, and I would encourage anyone to come up here and say g'day and come and try out the magnificent cocktails and things that we've been able to enjoy today. So congratulations on founding such an incredible business, and I really look forward to continuing to enjoy your gin.
Oh, Finn, you're too kind. It's been great having you out here today. Thanks for having me on anytime. Always happy to chat if anyone wants to drop by for a coffee or a martini. If I'm around, grab me.